Case number 1, Carla Homula and Paul Bernardo. On the outside, they were the perfect golden couple. Young, handsome, and polite. But behind closed doors, in suburban quiet, something unspeakably monstrous was slowly taking shape. Today, you and I are exploring how two ordinary newlyweds became architects of absolute horror, and how one walked free while the other was locked away forever. Long before the headlines, they were just a normal engaged couple living in quiet Ontario. She worked at a local animal clinic. She was cheerful, bright, and dependable. He carried a smooth, dangerous confidence, incredibly charming when he wanted to be. Their paths crossed in October 1987 at a pet convention, sparked by instant attraction. By December 1990, the two were planning a lavish wedding, eager for their shared future. But beneath that polished surface, a dark hunger was already beginning to stir. Unspeakable urges that would soon claim lives. On December 23, 1990, they struck for the first time while her family slept soundly upstairs. They executed a sick plan they had whispered about for weeks. Her 15-year-old sister was their target, drugged into unconsciousness with chemicals stolen from the animal clinic. They filmed the entire ordeal on camera tape that would eventually destroy them. When the young girl choked and stopped breathing, cold panic set in. They dressed her, moved her to another bedroom, and dialed 911. They claimed she drank too much at their holiday party. She died at the hospital. The police bought the story, ruling the tragedy an accidental choking incident. No one looked deeper. But the couple had crossed a dark threshold, and their appetite only grew in the months that followed. In June 1991, they targeted a 14-year-old girl locked out after curfew. They dragged her to their home, kept her captive for days, and took her life. Weeks later, her remains were found sealed inside concrete deep in a lake, shattering the local community. A massive manhunt began, yet the killers lived normally, even hosting a lavish wedding on the exact day her body was recovered. Just 10 months later, in April 1992, they struck once more. Their next victim was a 15-year-old girl, snatched from a church parking lot in broad daylight. Held hostage for 3 days, she was murdered and dumped in a nearby ditch. The grim pattern was now impossible to ignore. A predator was hunting local young women, sending the entire region into absolute panic. What you and I need to realize is that he had been secretly hunting long before he ever met her. Between 1987 and 1990, he terrorized the eastern side of the Greater Toronto area. He became known as a nocturnal attacker. Detectives had actually secured DNA samples from those crime scenes, but standard processing delays left that vital evidence sitting in a lab for over 2 years, a fatal mistake. The breakthrough came in January 1993, when she walked into an emergency room covered in severe wounds. Her face was badly fractured, and she had massive bruising. He had beaten her with a heavy flashlight. Pushed to her limit, she talked. She revealed the existence of home videotapes that documented every single crime. She claimed she was forced to participate, terrorized into obeying his demands. Police seized the physical tapes, and the footage was absolutely horrific to watch. The footage proved she was an active, eager participant, completely destroying her claims of innocence. But by the time investigators watched it, she had already secured a plea deal. For turning on her husband in court, she pleaded guilty to manslaughter and got a mere 12 years. That bargain was set in stone before prosecutors realized just how deeply involved she was. As you and I can imagine, when details of that plea deal leaked, immense outrage erupted nationwide. Citizens felt justice had failed. His trial began in 1995 and lasted for months. The visual evidence was shown to the jury, proving cold, calculated cruelty. His guilt was undeniable. The jury quickly convicted him, resulting in a life sentence with no parole for 25 years. He was labeled a dangerous offender, ensuring he would likely spend the rest of his life locked away. She finished her sentence, walking free in 2005. After a short stay in the Caribbean, she returned to Canada under a completely new name. Efforts to restrict her freedom were legally challenged and eventually thrown out. Today, she has a new family, living quietly in total anonymity. Whenever her whereabouts were discovered over the years, public outrage erupted all over again. The victims' families repeatedly expressed absolute devastation that she rebuilt her life while their loved ones were gone forever. This case fundamentally transformed how Canadian prosecutors handle plea bargains for serious crimes. It became a warning about rushing into deals before examining every single piece of evidence. Legal experts still debate whether that agreement should have been thrown out once videotapes revealed her full participation, but the law back then did not allow for that, so the controversial bargain stood. Parole hearings have come and gone with no success. Every few years he applies again, and each time the victims' families show up to oppose his release. They speak of unending pain, of ruined lives, and of a man who has never shown real remorse. Parole boards repeatedly rule that he remains a major threat to public safety. The story of these two stands as one of the darkest chapters in Canadian criminal history, not only because of their horrific actions, but because the justice system struggled to hold them fully accountable. While we are still processing that, let us look at a daughter who built an elaborate web of lies that cost her mother everything. In the case of Jennifer Pan, minor lies snowballed into an absolute catastrophe. But this was different. This was an entire life built on fabrication, a decade-long act that ended in blood. What happens when the pressure to be perfect becomes completely unbearable? For one young woman in suburban Toronto, the dark answer would shock the entire nation. Born in 1986, her hard-working parents fled their homeland as refugees, arriving in Canada with nothing and building a middle-class life through sheer determination. Her father labored in manufacturing, while her mother spent her days assembling auto parts. They pinched every penny, eventually buying a large home in Markham, a wealthy community north of Toronto. Their dream was simple: give their children every opportunity. Education was paramount, and high achievement was expected. Failure was never an option. From early childhood, she excelled, filling shelves with piano trophies. She trained as a figure skater with Olympic dreams until a knee injury crushed those hopes. At school, she brought home top grades, or so her parents thought. Teachers constantly praised her work ethic. She seemed destined for great things: university, career success, the very life her parents sacrificed everything to build. But faking perfection is exhausting. Sometime during her high school years, the perfect facade began to crack. She failed calculus, losing her college acceptance. Too terrified to tell her parents, she began forging documents. She pretended to go to classes that did not exist. For years, she hid out in coffee shops and libraries while her family thought she was studying pharmacy at university. She forged transcripts, made up volunteer work at a children's hospital, and even invented a pharmacy job. Every detail was carefully crafted to keep up the illusion. The motive behind this deep deception was complicated. Part of it was born from a deep fear of disappointing them. But another trigger was a forbidden relationship with a young man they disliked, whom she saw secretly for years. Once her parents discovered the romance, they issued an ultimatum: end it or be cut off completely. She chose to keep seeing him in secret, demanding even more lies. By 2010, the intense pressure became unbearable. At 24 years old, she lived a double life that demanded constant vigilance. Her parents grew highly suspicious, asking tougher questions as the lies collapsed. That was when she made a fatal decision. Using her boyfriend's street connections, she arranged to hire hitmen willing to carry out violence for cash. The plan, as detectives later pieced it together, was to stage a violent home invasion that would ultimately end both of her parents' lives. She hoped to inherit their money and insurance payouts, letting her live freely with the man she loved. On the night of November 8, 2010, 3 men entered the family home. The intruders forced her parents into the basement and opened fire. Her mother died at the scene. Her father was shot in the face and shoulder, but miraculously survived. The shooters fled, and she called 911, claiming she had been tied up but left unharmed. At first, police treated it as a random burglary, but the details did not make sense. Why leave a witness alive, able to call for help with supposedly tied hands? Why did the intruders leave valuable items untouched throughout the house? Then her father woke from his coma with a shattering revelation. He had seen his daughter whispering to one of the intruders like an old friend. Detectives brought her in for questioning, and through her first 2 interviews, she kept up the lie. But during the 3rd interrogation, detectives confronted her with the hard evidence they had gathered. Cell records, text messages, witness statements. Her facade shattered, and she finally admitted she was involved in the plot. Still, she claimed she never wanted things to go this far, insisting everything had spiraled out of control. 4 other suspects were arrested, including her boyfriend and the recruiter, along with the 2 men who entered the home that night. The trial began in March 2014, lasting 10 months with over 50 witnesses testifying. Prosecutors presented more than 200 pieces of evidence. The prosecution painted this as a cold, calculated plan driven by greed and a desperate urge to escape her parents. The defense argued that while she helped set the events in motion, her mental state was far more complicated than simple greed. Jurors learned about her years of lies, forged documents, and secret double life, reviewing texts that mapped out the payment and logistics. They listened to her father's devastating testimony, delivered through a translator, describing how he trusted his daughter and never dreamed she would orchestrate violence against her own family. On December 13, 2014, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their final verdict: guilty on all counts. She and 3 co-conspirators received life sentences with no chance of parole for 25 years. A 5th accomplice pleaded guilty to lesser charges, receiving 18 years. At sentencing, her father delivered a statement that reduced the courtroom to tears. He spoke of losing both his wife and daughter in a single night, of wondering where he failed as a father, and of hoping she might someday find her humanity. He said he would never laugh the same way again. The case sparked intense debate over parental pressure and mental health in immigrant communities, and the dark side of perfectionism. Some saw her as a victim of impossible expectations who snapped under pressure. Others saw cold, calculated cruelty disguised as desperation. But everyone agreed on the absolute tragedy of it all. A family ruined, lives cut short, and a daughter who destroyed her own future to escape her parents' plans. Years later, in 2023, an appeals court ordered a new trial for some charges, ruling the jury should have had more options during deliberation. Still, the conviction for the attempt on her father's life stood firm, and whether she will face another trial remains unclear. But the story of the daughter who played a deadly double life continues to haunt everyone who followed it. Now, let's turn our attention to another trusted figure, a caregiver whose secret actions would expose catastrophic failures in an entire system. Case 3. Elizabeth Wetlauer. Trust is the absolute foundation of medicine, especially in homes where the elderly spend their final quiet years. Families place their loved ones in these facilities, fully believing they will be treated with compassion and dignity. But what happens when the nurse dispensing daily medication is actually dispensing death? This is the chilling story of how one nurse used her access to vulnerable patients to carry out a decade of undetected horror. She was born in June 1967 and grew up in rural Ontario near Woodstock. Raised in a highly religious household, she earned a degree in religious studies before pivoting to a career in nursing. By 1995, she was a registered nurse, embarking on a path that led her across southwestern Ontario. Colleagues remembered her as quiet, a bit troubled, but seemingly dedicated to her job. No one guessed what she was doing on her night shifts alone. Then, in June 2007, she joined a long-term care home in Woodstock. Just 2 months later, she made her first deliberate move. On August 11th, she gave a lethal dose of insulin to an 84-year-old World War II veteran, ending his life. Because of his age and frail health, nobody suspected a thing. Doctors ruled the death natural, but inside her, something shifted. She later recalled feeling a red surge beforehand, followed by a dark, laughing sensation afterward. She even claimed she believed some higher power was guiding her hands. Over the next 7 years at that facility, she took 6 more lives the exact same way, using fatal insulin doses that looked like natural organ failure. The victims were aged 79 to 96, some suffering from dementia, making them completely helpless targets. She worked the night shift, handing out heavy medication to dozens of elderly residents with almost zero supervision. The insulin was locked away, but the nurses held all the keys. No double checks, no verification, no second eyes. She could inject whoever she pleased, and no one would ever notice. Between 2007 and 2014, she tried to harm at least 6 other patients who miraculously survived. Some got terribly sick but pulled through. Others needed emergency intervention to survive. Yet, no one raised any alarms. Co-workers noticed medication errors and strange behavior, but she got off with warnings and just kept on working. When she left in 2014, her bosses wrote her a reference letter mostly to avoid a fight with the union. She hopped between jobs, moving to another nursing home, private houses, and even schools. In 2014 and 2015, she struck again, taking the life of a 75-year-old man in London and attacking 2 more people. Her last target was a 68-year-old woman receiving home care in August of 2016. Right after that, she was sent to a school, tasked with giving insulin to children with diabetes. The idea absolutely terrified her, but not because she felt any guilt. She was afraid she wouldn't be able to stop herself from hurting them. She resigned, checking into a Toronto psychiatric hospital in September 2016. That was where everything finally fell apart. She confessed what she had done to the hospital staff. The staff immediately called the police and the nursing college. On September 29th, investigators interviewed her for the first time. She gave a 2.5-hour filmed confession, detailing every single victim and her compulsions. They arrested her on October 24th, 2016. The public was left in absolute shock and horror. How does someone murder 8 people over 9 years without getting caught? The truth lies in massive systemic failures. Insulin overdoses are incredibly hard to detect after death, especially in elderly diabetic patients. Coroners simply didn't investigate natural-looking deaths in nursing homes. Care homes were understaffed, sometimes leaving 1 nurse to watch over 99 patients. Red flags about her performance were written down, but nobody ever acted on them. Most disturbing of all, she had confessed multiple times before her arrest, to an ex-partner, pastors, a lawyer, and acquaintances. Some brushed her stories off as sick fantasies. Others threatened to report her if she kept going, but never did. One lawyer she spoke with told her to stay quiet. Absolutely no one called the police. She skipped her preliminary hearing and pleaded guilty to every single charge in court in June 2017. On June 26th, she received 8 concurrent life sentences for murder, plus extra years for her attempted attacks. She will not be eligible for parole until she serves at least 25 years. The judge presiding over her case called her crimes a true abomination, calling her a shadow of death passing over the vulnerable. The families of her victims were completely devastated, not just by their painful losses, but by learning how easily this could have been stopped. Most would never have known the truth without her confession. Following the scandal, Ontario launched a massive public inquiry headed by an appeals court judge. The investigation spanned 2 years, digging into exactly how she managed to slip through the cracks for so long. The final report, published in July 2019, put forward 91 recommendations for reform. It demanded better staffing, strict control over high-risk drugs, mandatory reporting, and deeper background checks on healthcare workers. Investigators concluded that deep systemic gaps, not just one bad nurse, allowed this tragedy to happen. It became a major turning point for care facility regulations in Ontario. Care homes installed glass doors on medicine rooms and forced staff to double-verify high-risk drugs. They made it easier for staff to report issues, but the damage was already done. 8 families lost loved ones who were supposed to be safe. 6 other families nearly lost their relatives, forcing the entire province to face how badly they failed their most vulnerable citizens. Today, she remains locked away, one of Canada's most prolific medical killers. Her name represents the ultimate failure of system oversight. Her dark story still raises terrifying questions today. How many other predators are hiding in plain sight? And how do we stop this from ever happening again? From medical horror to digital nightmares. Next, we look at how the web became a hunting ground for a killer sparking a global manhunt. Case 4, Luca Magnotta. The internet spawned a dark new fame, a place where attention seekers could easily craft fake personas and broadcast them worldwide. But when deep narcissism collides with violence, the results are devastating. It all started with disturbing online videos of animals and ended with body parts mailed across an entire continent, proving that the warnings are often there long before anyone acts. He was born in July 1982 in Scarborough, Ontario, under a completely different name. Even as a young boy, he was completely obsessed with fame and attention. Growing up, he drifted through random jobs, but his true focus was always on becoming famous. He tried modeling and built multiple online personas, anything to get noticed. By 2007, he was spreading wild rumors about himself, even claiming to date a notorious criminal to grab media attention. A reporter who interviewed him back then called him deeply troubled, but assumed he was only a danger to himself. Between 2010 and 2011, online sleuths tracking dark web content identified him as the monster behind brutal animal cruelty videos. Uploaded under various aliases, these videos showed rapidly escalating cruelty. Desperate animal rights groups offered a reward to identify him, reaching out to police across several countries. They issued a chilling warning anyone capable of such violence against animals would eventually target humans. Their terrifying warnings would prove tragically accurate. In May 2012, a 33-year-old student from China vanished in Montreal. He was studying at Concordia University, working part-time for his future. His friends grew worried when he suddenly went completely silent. Days later, horrific packages started arriving at political offices and schools across Canada. Inside were human remains. A severed foot arrived at the Conservative Party headquarters in Ottawa. A hand was sent to the Liberals. More body parts were shipped to schools in Vancouver, while a torso was found stuffed in a suitcase outside a Montreal apartment. Meanwhile, a video with a truly sickening title surfaced online. The footage showed a helpless victim being tortured in ways far too graphic to describe. Police quickly realized the victim was the missing student, and the killer was the very same man behind the horrific animal abuse videos. A global manhunt erupted, and Interpol immediately issued a red notice. Police tracked his desperate flight across Europe. On June 4, 2012, German officers caught him at a Berlin internet cafe, reading articles about his own crimes. He was arrested without a fight and extradited back to Canada on June 18th. The trial began in September 2014 and lasted 10 weeks. His lawyers claimed he suffered from severe mental illness, specifically schizophrenia, arguing he shouldn't be held criminally responsible because he was completely unable to tell right from wrong during the crime. Several psychiatrists testified about his mental health struggles, which began back when he was a teenager. But prosecutors brought in their own experts, arguing that while he had personality disorders, he fully understood what he was doing. They showed proof of meticulous planning, like buying kill supplies weeks in advance, researching locations, and deliberately recording the murder to post online. They argued a psychotic person couldn't pull off such calculated steps. Crucially, the killer chose not to take the stand, meaning the jury never heard his side of the story regarding his mental state. Legal experts noted that this devastatingly undermined his lawyer's entire case, since Canadian law requires the defense to prove insanity. After 8 days of heavy deliberation, the jury returned on December 23, 2014 with a guilty verdict on all 5 charges, including first-degree murder for the student's horrific death. He was also convicted of desecrating human remains, mailing obscene materials, using the postal service for terror, and harassing public officials. In Canada, first-degree murder carries an automatic life sentence with no parole for 25 years. He also received concurrent sentences totaling 19 years for the other crimes. The judge called the crimes some of the most horrifying the court had ever witnessed. The victim's grieving father sat through every single day of the trial, listening through a translator. Following the verdict, a lawyer read the father's statement, expressing his absolute, devastating grief. He spoke of losing his beloved son and the agonizing pain of trying to remember him. He traveled to Canada hoping for justice, leaving relieved that the legal system did his son right, but deeply bitter that he never received a real explanation or apology from the killer. This brutal case captured intense international media attention, partly due to its horrific nature, but also because it raised unsettling questions about accountability on online platforms. The graphic video was shared and viewed thousands of times before finally being taken down. Fierce debates erupted over whether websites hosting such horrific material should face legal charges. People also wondered if police should have listened to animal rights activists, who had accurately predicted this escalation long before the tragedy occurred. Years later, a hit documentary series chronicled how a dedicated online community hunted the killer down before the police did. The show became a massive sensation, exposing the dangers of internet vigilantism and the darkest corners of the web, places where online attention-seeking behavior festers into real-world violence. Today, he remains locked away in a maximum security prison. Parole hearings will eventually come, but with a minimum 25-year sentence to serve for his brutal crimes, freedom is decades away. His name now stands for pure internet-age horror, proving that extreme narcissism paired with violence can spawn nightmares that cross oceans, moving from digital infamy to family tragedy. Next, we examine a case that forced an entire country to confront deep cultural divides. Case 5. The Shafia Family Honor Killings. Immigration shapes nations, introducing vibrant cultures and new perspectives to existing communities. But what happens when ancient traditions collide violently with modern freedoms? In June 2009, 4 women died in a horrific tragedy that sparked a national debate over cultural customs, female autonomy, and the boundaries of tolerance within a multicultural nation. The family at the heart of this tragedy had traveled far to reach Canada. They fled Afghanistan for Dubai, moved to Australia, and finally settled in Montreal in 2007. The father quickly built a lucrative business importing and exporting general merchandise. Living in an affluent neighborhood and driving luxury cars, they seemed to have captured the ultimate immigrant dream. The household consisted of the father, his wife, 7 children, and his first wife from a polygamous marriage. Publicly, she was introduced as a cousin helping with the kids. But in private, deep resentment simmered. The 3 teenage daughters attended local schools, made new friends, and adopted lifestyles their parents absolutely despised. They wanted Western clothes, dated boys, and rebelled against the family's oppressive rules. Teachers and child protection workers repeatedly heard disturbing complaints from the girls about their hostile home life. One sister confessed to an administrator that she wanted to run away. Another admitted she felt like dying. The youngest, just 13, was bold and rebellious, constantly clashing with her father's strict, unyielding rules. In May 2009, the 19-year-old daughter secretly wed a man her family hated. The marriage was annulled within 24 hours, but her defiance left the father utterly consumed with rage. Police wiretaps later caught him declaring that even if they executed him, family honor and reputation meant everything. On June 30th, 2009, the family headed back to Montreal after vacationing in Niagara Falls. Driving in 2 separate cars, they checked into a roadside motel in Kingston to rest. The following morning, an employee at the Kingston Mills Locks spotted a dark Nissan Sentra submerged in the canal. Inside were 4 victims: the 3 teen sisters, ages 19, 17, and 13, and the father's 52-year-old first wife. At first, police believed it was a horrific accident. Soon, the father arrived to report his family members missing. The parents claimed their eldest daughter had knocked on their door late at night to borrow the car keys, wanting to take her sisters and aunt for a late-night joyride. They blamed a wrong turn, but investigators immediately noticed problems with their story. Crucially, the motel manager remembered only 6 guests checking in, not the entire 10-member family. Cell phone records later proved the son's phone was near those locks days earlier, indicating a planned scouting mission. Web searches on the family computers showed chilling searches for deep bodies of water and perfect places to commit a crime. But the forensics were most damning. Scratches on the Nissan matched their Lexus SUV, and the car's final resting position proved it had been pushed into the canal, not driven. On July 23, 2009, detectives arrested both parents, along with their 20-year-old son, on charges of first-degree murder and conspiracy. The trial began in October 2011 and lasted nearly 3 months. The prosecution argued the crime was a calculated act, driven by what they described as protecting the family's reputation. They showed evidence of constant abuse and death threats hidden in diary entries, as well as the girls' desperate pleas to the police. Wiretapped phone calls recorded after the tragedy proved absolutely devastating. In the recordings, the father called the victims treacherous. He claimed they deserved their fate, hurling vulgar insults at them and their boyfriends. Repeatedly, he declared that his sense of honor mattered far more than their lives. The defense countered that the tragic deaths were merely accidental, arguing that the eldest daughter, an inexperienced driver, had simply lost control of the car. Based on cell phone records, They argued there wasn't enough time for the accused to travel from the motel to the locks and return. They disputed the forensic findings and attacked the witnesses' credibility, but the state's case was just too strong. Experts testified about deeply rooted patterns of violence tied to family shame in specific cultures. Heartbroken teachers recalled the girls begging them for help. The son's online search history showed him researching how to carry out the crime, and those wiretapped recordings spoke for themselves. The father displayed zero remorse, expressing only anger that his daughters had embarrassed the family. On January 29, 2012, after 15 hours of deliberation, the jury found all three defendants guilty of first-degree murder. All three received automatic life sentences with no chance of parole for 25 years. The judge called their crimes cold-blooded, describing them as shameful acts born from a twisted concept of honor that has no place in civilized society. The guilty verdict sparked a massive public reaction. Many praised the legal system for holding the killers accountable, regardless of their cultural background, but others feared the case would fuel prejudice against vulnerable immigrant communities. Muslim organizations across Canada quickly condemned the violence, making it clear that these acts have zero basis in Islamic teachings. The Afghan embassy called the tragedy a heinous crime against humanity, emphasizing that honor-based violence contradicts both Afghan and Islamic values. Intense media coverage sparked debates over whether to label the tragedy an honor killing or simply domestic violence. Some argued that focusing on culture only stigmatized entire communities. But as you and I can see, naming the specific motivation was necessary to protect vulnerable individuals in similar danger. In the years following, Canada has introduced new measures to identify and protect young people at risk of family-based violence. Schools now receive training to recognize critical warning signs. Immigration guides explicitly warn that Canadian law strictly prohibits violence, regardless of any cultural or religious justifications. The three surviving children were placed in protective care, eventually building new lives far away from the public eye. While behind bars, the mother filed for divorce and has received brief, supervised releases for compassionate reasons. The father and son filed multiple appeals, but all were rejected. They still claim innocence, but the evidence against them remains insurmountable. This horrific case left a permanent scar on Canadian society, forcing hard conversations about the limits of multiculturalism and women's rights. It serves as a reminder that protecting freedom sometimes requires confronting ancient traditions, no matter how difficult those conversations might be. 4 vibrant young women were robbed of their chance to live freely, and that tragedy still echoes through every discussion of their story. Next, we look at Bruce MacArthur. He was the type of man everyone trusted. Hardworking, charming, and helpful, he landscaped beautiful gardens and helped elderly neighbors with their groceries. During the holidays, he even played Santa Claus at the local mall, smiling warmly for photos with children. No one ever suspected that the very hands planting flowers were also burying bodies. Let's unfold the chilling tale of how Toronto's most notorious serial killer operated in plain sight, while a vulnerable community paid the ultimate price. Before anyone discovered his dark side, he seemed like an ordinary guy living a quiet life. Born in the early 1950s, he grew up in Ontario, eventually married, and raised 2 children in the suburbs. For years, he earned a living as a traveling salesman, peddling socks and underwear across the region. But when his marriage fell apart in the late 1990s, something dark shifted inside him. He relocated to Toronto, integrated into the local scene, and launched a modest landscaping company called Artistic Design. Homeowners loved him. He was precise, quiet, and always arrived on time. He secured access to backyards citywide by trading storage space for free lawn care. It was the ideal setup for a man seeking privacy, but nobody suspected his social life hid a sinister side. He spent his nights visiting bars in a lively district known for its diverse nightlife. Casual acquaintances saw a different side, a controlling, moody man with a sudden, explosive temper. In 2001, he was convicted of assaulting someone with a metal pipe. A psychological assessment suggested he held deep resentments, but deemed him a low threat to the public. After serving house arrest and probation, his restrictions expired, allowing him to quietly slip back into his normal routine. The first vanishing later linked to him occurred back in September of 2010. A 40-year-old man dating the landscaper disappeared after leaving a local bar late one evening. Loved ones raised the alarm, but without clues or a body, the case went cold. Within months, other men started vanishing from that very same neighborhood. Many were vulnerable immigrants living quiet, private lives on the margins of society. Families pleaded for help, but with scarce evidence of foul play, progress ground to a halt. By 2012, police finally formed a task force to investigate the pattern. 3 men were now missing, all connected to the exact same area and sharing similar traits. Detectives questioned dozens of residents, including the landscaper, who knew one of the victims. But lacking physical evidence to tie him to the crimes, his name remained buried in a growing case file. After 18 months with 0 arrests, the task force was shut down. Locals felt totally abandoned, believing the police were ignoring their fears. From 2013 through 2015, more men kept vanishing. Some were vulnerable refugees, while others battled homelessness or addiction. Some families searched frantically, but other victims had nobody to notice they had gone missing. Neighbors whispered about a serial killer, but officials insisted there was no proof of a single predator. Trust in law enforcement completely disintegrated. Then, in June 2017, a prominent local activist vanished right after the city's Pride Parade. Unlike the earlier victims, his vast circle of friends instantly realized he was gone. They forced the police to act, sparking a new task force that retraced his final steps. Security cameras caught him getting into the landscaper's red van. That breakthrough changed the entire investigation. With a warrant in hand, investigators secretly searched his apartment in December 2017. The files on his computer were absolutely horrifying photos of men, some taken after they had died. The killer had cataloged his victims like trophies, bound and posed with props like cigars and fur coats. Police also found jewelry from the missing victims, alongside a duffel bag stuffed with duct tape, rope, zip ties, and other tools of torture. On January 18, 2018, police closed in. As officers entered his building, they spotted him arriving with a new target. Storming the apartment, they discovered the man tied to a bed, luckily still alive. They had rescued what would have been his 9th victim just in time, arresting the 67-year-old landscaper without any struggle. The murder investigation that followed quickly became the largest in Toronto police history. Detectives methodically searched dozens of properties where he had done landscaping. At a quiet midtown home, cadaver dogs alerted officers to several large planters stored on the lawn. Buried deep inside those planters, under soil and flowers, were the dismembered remains of 7 victims. Police eventually found an 8th set of human remains in a nearby ravine. The shocked homeowner, a client who trusted him for years, was devastated to learn her property was a secret graveyard. Forensic specialists worked for weeks carefully recovering evidence. DNA testing eventually confirmed the identities of all 8 victims. The victims ranged from 37 to 58 years old, with most cases involving brutal restraint. Prosecutors painted him as a calculated predator who intentionally hunted the city's most vulnerable. He initially pleaded not guilty, with a trial scheduled for 2019. But in January of that year, in a sudden twist, he changed his plea and admitted guilt to all 8 counts. The courtroom was packed with grieving families and community advocates who had fought for years to see this moment. As each of the 8 counts was read aloud, he quietly muttered guilty and sat back down. During his February 2019 sentencing, agonizing victim impact statements were read aloud. Families spoke of loved ones lost without explanation, of endless years wondering, and of grief made worse by agonizing silence. One woman, whose land was used to hide remains, felt haunted knowing she had been so close to the dark truth. She described him as 2 different people, a kind, enthusiastic worker, and a monster who committed unspeakable acts in the shadows. The judge handed down a life sentence with no chance of parole for 25 years, the mandatory penalty. Since he pleaded guilty to multiple charges, his life sentences would run concurrently, not back-to-back. Experts pointed out that while he could technically apply for parole after 20 years, his chances of actually getting out were virtually 0, given the horrific nature of his crimes. The case shook Toronto to its core, sparking heavy backlash over how police handled the initial investigation. Why did it take so long for investigators to spot the pattern? Why were urgent warnings from local residents ignored for so long? And why didn't the initial task force chase down every lead aggressively? Facing pressure, police formed a specialized missing persons unit and updated how they track cases involving vulnerable groups. For the targeted community, the truth brought a painful mix of relief and deep anguish. They felt relief that a killer was finally caught, but agonizing heartbreak knowing lives could have been saved with quicker action. Vigils were held, victims' names were read aloud, and families gathered to grieve together. The tragedy served as a brutal reminder that marginalized people often face systemic neglect when they vanish. Today, he is locked away in a maximum security prison. As one of Canada's oldest serial killers, his name is rarely mentioned without honoring the lives he stole. 8 innocent men who deserved safety, dignity, and justice. Their once ignored stories now stand as a grim indictment of a system that failed to protect them. Leaving behind a predator hiding in plain sight, we turn to a man with a completely different reputation. A highly respected military leader whose secret, double life would shock the world. Case 7. Russell Williams. Some spend their entire lives building flawless reputations, racking up medals, and earning deep respect from everyone. But what happens when that perfect image conceals a monster? This is the story of a pilot who flew royalty, commanded thousands, and led a secret life so depraved it became one of Canada's most chilling scandals. Born in England in March 1963, he immigrated to Canada as a young child. Raised in a wealthy home, he excelled at top schools before studying economics and political science in college. In 1987, he joined the Canadian military, launching a highly decorated career. Training as a pilot, he quickly proved his sharp skill and strict discipline, climbing steadily through the ranks. By the 2000s, he was a decorated officer trusted with the military's most sensitive duties. He flew high-profile aircraft, transporting dignitaries, including the Queen herself, the Prime Minister, and foreign leaders. Peers described him as driven, highly professional, and detail-oriented. In July 2009, he became a colonel, taking command of Canada's busiest military airbase. The role put him in charge of over 4,000 personnel. To colleagues, he was the gold standard of service. Yet beneath that spotless uniform, a dark obsession was growing. Beginning in September 2007, homes near his quiet cottage experienced bizarre break-ins. The intruder ignored cash and electronics, stealing only women's clothing and intimate undergarments. The strange pattern caught the attention of police, but with zero leads and scarce evidence, the cases went cold. Investigators had no idea the thief was keeping detailed records, taking photographs of himself, posing in the stolen clothing, and logging every detail. By September 2009, things escalated. Deep in the night, a small-town woman woke to find an intruder in her room. He bound and photographed her before vanishing. Just 2 weeks later, another woman nearby suffered the exact same terrifying ordeal. Both victims gave statements to the police, but the disguised predator left almost no physical evidence behind. Panic gripped the community, as everyone realized a dangerous predator was hunting in their neighborhood. Then, in late November 2009, a 38-year-old military member was found dead inside her home. She worked at the base commanded by the colonel, and her nearby home showed clear signs of a violent struggle. Investigators poured everything into the case, but with virtually no leads, progress ground to a halt. Her colleagues mourned, never dreaming the killer was one of their own. Then, just 2 months later, in late January 2010, another woman vanished. At 27 years old, she lived alone in a rural area, last seen by friends the previous evening. When she missed work and her car sat untouched in the driveway, worried family members called the police. A massive search quickly began, drawing in hundreds of local volunteers and military resources from the nearby base, ironically authorized by the very man responsible for making her disappear. The case broke wide open when witnesses recalled a highly unique vehicle parked near her home the night she went missing. Detectives analyzed the tire tracks left at the crime scene and matched them to a specific model. On February 4, 2010, officers set up highway checkpoints throughout the entire area, stopping any car that fit the profile. One belonged to the colonel himself, and police brought him in. What followed would go down as one of the most famous interrogations in Canadian history. For several hours, detectives methodically laid out the evidence, including tire tracks, surveillance footage, and timelines. The colonel stayed remarkably calm, insisting he knew absolutely nothing. But as the proof piled up, his calm exterior shattered, and he confessed to the kidnapping, plus the November murder, and dozens of home invasions and assaults going back over 2 years. He then gave police directions to where he had hidden the young woman's body. On February 7, 2010, he was formally charged. Within hours, the military replaced him with an interim commander and erased his profile from official websites. The country was completely stunned. How could a highly decorated officer abuse his power to commit such atrocities? It raised serious questions about how the military screens and monitors its top leadership. As the investigation deepened, even more sickening details surfaced. Police found thousands of disturbing photos and videos on his computer, uncovering 82 break-ins over 3 years. His files revealed an escalating dark path starting with simple theft, moving to non-contact offenses, escalating to physical assaults, and ultimately ending in cold-blooded murder. He kept detailed logs of his crimes, even leaving notes for victims. He once broke into a 12-year-old's bedroom and left a message on her computer thanking her in French. The trial was set for October 2010, but he made a shocking move before it started. On October 18th, he pleaded guilty to all 88 charges. This included 2 counts of murder, 2 of forcible confinement, 2 of assault, and 82 counts of breaking and entering. By confessing, he avoided a long trial, sparing the victims' families from listening to months of horrific details in court. At his sentencing, prosecutors laid out a detailed statement of facts revealing the true scope of his crimes. The court heard how he stalked his prey, planned every move, and kept records with terrifying precision. Heartbreaking victim impact statements left the room in tears. One victim's father stood up to address him directly, saying that when he ran his son over with a plow-weight, wrong case. Let me correct that. The father of one victim shared the agony of losing his daughter, while her mother described their endless grief, the constant unanswered questions, and the ultimate betrayal of a military leader meant to protect them committing such evil. The second victim's widow spoke next, explaining how her life lay in ruins and how their little boy would grow up fatherless. Again, wrong case. Let me stay focused. Families of both women who were murdered delivered incredibly powerful impact statements. One family remembered their daughter as vibrant, dedicated, and full of life, her life stolen by a trusted co-worker. The other family wept for a daughter who loved life, had big dreams, and plans for the future all ripped away by a predator who fooled everyone. On October 22, 2010, the judge handed down a life sentence with no chance of parole for 25 years. Other charges ran concurrently, locking him away for decades, but the fallout from his actions reached far beyond his prison cell. Soon after, the Governor General stripped his commission, officially kicking him out of the military. His rank was gone, his uniform burned, his medals smashed, and his official commission papers shredded. It was a total public military degradation. Yet, legal loopholes allowed him to keep his military pension, as stopping it would have required a literal act of parliament. The shocking case forced deep soul-searching throughout the army and the entire nation. How did a man living this monstrous double life slip through every background check, evaluation, and security screening? Investigators launched reviews, overhauled protocols, and put new safety measures in place. But for the public, the broken trust could never be repaired. Today, he sits behind bars, serving his life term far away from the spotlight. Police and military academies now study his case, teaching recruits how deadly, predatory monsters can hide behind highly respected personas. The quiet towns where he hunted have slowly rebuilt, though the deep scars never truly fade. And the victims' families must live with the haunting reality that a man sworn to protect ended up destroying their lives, falling from absolute power into utter disgrace. His ruin stands as a terrifying reminder that titles and uniforms never guarantee character, and that absolute evil easily wears a convincing disguise. But while that case exposed betrayal in high places, this next story reveals how malice can strike from the most unexpected corners, targeting the most innocent lives imaginable. Case 8, Terry Lynn McClintock and Michael Rafferty. Some tragedies are so devastating they change a nation forever. We are about to look at one of them. It is the story of an 8-year-old girl who just wanted to see a puppy, and the pair whose choices that spring afternoon triggered one of Canada's most horrific crimes. She was a bright third grader from the town of Woodstock, Ontario, a close-knit community where neighbors kept watch and kids safely walked home from school. Born in the year 2000, she loved baseball and sports, carrying an infectious smile that lit up any room. Though her parents were split up, she happily shared time between both, surrounded by a big, adoring family and loyal friends. April 8, 2009 began like any ordinary Wednesday. She headed out in a Hannah Montana shirt and her mom's butterfly earrings. Once the school bell rang that afternoon, she started her brief walk home. Meanwhile, a troubled 18-year-old woman lingered near the schoolyard. She was dating a 28-year-old man, and though it had only been a few months, their relationship was already toxic and heavily manipulative. Earlier that day, court records show, he ordered her to find a child, any young kid walking alone. She later insisted she had no idea what he really planned, but she went along with it. She spent hours pacing back and forth near the schoolyard, eyeing the kids as classes dismissed. When the 8-year-old strolled past by herself, the woman approached her. She talked about owning a small dog, the exact same breed the girl had at home. The child smiled instantly, asking if she could see the pet. The woman agreed, gently guiding her toward a parking lot where a car sat idling. Security footage from a nearby nursing home caught the pair walking side by side. The woman put a guiding hand on her shoulder. Seconds later, they reached the car, forced the little girl inside, and sped off. Over the next few hours, they drove the child all across southern Ontario, making 3 brief stops. During one stop, the woman walked into a hardware store and bought a heavy claw hammer and trash bags. Bystanders later remembered seeing that car, but no one suspected the horror unfolding inside. Finally, they stopped in a remote field near Mount Forest, about 100 kilometers from Woodstock. The horrors that happened there were detailed in court years later. It was testimony so dark that jurors required therapy afterward. That evening, the girl's mother walked inside, expecting to see her daughter. When she found only an empty house, raw panic instantly took over. Desperate calls to friends led nowhere, and a quick search of the neighborhood turned up absolutely nothing. By late that night, authorities were notified, and a massive search for a missing child began. Within hours, detectives upgraded the case to kidnapping. They released security footage from a retirement home showing a young woman walking off with the little girl. Tips started flooding in. One crucial tip came from the child's own mother, who recognized the woman on screen. She gave police her name and revealed she was already wanted by law enforcement. On April 12th, officers arrested the woman on that outstanding warrant and brought her in for questioning. Under interrogation, she finally cracked and confessed her involvement, admitting she had lured the little girl into a car driven by her boyfriend. She detailed exactly where they drove and what took place. She led detectives to a field near Mount Forest, where on July 19, 2009, over 3 months after she vanished, the child's body was found hidden under a pile of rocks. The autopsy revealed a truly horrific scene. The child had suffered a savage beating, resulting in 16 broken ribs and severe internal trauma. She was killed by repeated blows to the head with a hammer. These grim findings devastated both the local community and the entire country. Public vigils were held, ribbons were tied around trees, and her school set up moving memorials in her memory. But as the community grieved, intense anger mounted against the 2 people responsible. Both faced first-degree murder charges. Confronted with overwhelming evidence, the woman ultimately pleaded guilty in April 2010. At her sentencing, she expressed deep remorse and claimed she was heavily manipulated. But prosecutors argued she had made active, deliberate choices every step of the way. She was handed a life sentence with no chance of parole for 25 years. At the time, she was just 21 years old. Her boyfriend, however, maintained his innocence and went to trial. The court proceedings began in March 2012, lasting 10 weeks. The state's case relied heavily on the woman's testimony. Taking the stand, she described the chilling events of that April afternoon. She testified that kidnapping a child was his idea, and that he was the one who beat her, though she admitted she delivered the final fatal hammer blows herself in a sudden fit of rage. This new story directly contradicted what she originally told police, casting serious doubt on her credibility. Defense lawyers hammered her testimony, exposing her own dark history of violent behavior, her track record of lying, and glaring inconsistencies. They argued she was the real mastermind behind the kidnapping, while he was just a terrified bystander. But the prosecution had hard forensic evidence. Cell phone tracking placed him at every crime scene, and DNA linked him directly to the physical evidence, along with security footage showing the child getting into his car. On May 11, 2012, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned. Guilty on all counts. He was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and the horrific abuse of a minor. The courtroom erupted. Tears of relief mixed with angry shouts directed at the convicted killer. He sat there stone-faced, showing no emotion. 4 days later at his sentencing, family members read heartbreaking victim impact statements. The mother spoke of her unbearable grief and the stolen future of her precious little girl. A statement was read for her 14-year-old brother, who described losing the only person in the world who truly understood him. He wrote that he felt completely isolated, as if life was playing some sick, cruel joke. Addressing the killer directly, the judge called him a monster, condemning his actions as pure evil done to satisfy a twisted urge. He received the exact same sentence, life in prison with no parole for 25 years. But the story didn't end there. Both killers filed appeals on multiple legal grounds, but their efforts were quickly thrown out. Years later, a massive controversy erupted when the woman was moved from a maximum security prison to an indigenous healing lodge. The transfer triggered national outrage. The victim's family and the public demanded to know why a child killer was getting such lenient treatment. Under massive public pressure, she was sent back to a standard prison. But the tragedy left deep scars that will never heal. The young girl's father turned to advocacy, fighting for victims' rights and demanding major reforms in how the justice system treats grieving families. New laws were proposed to guarantee families get notified about inmate transfers and parole hearings. The small town of Woodstock, forever scarred by the tragedy, still honors her memory with scholarships and public monuments. Today, this case remains a chilling reminder of how fast innocence can be shattered and how the ripples of evil touch us all. An 8-year-old boy who loved baseball and just wanted to see a puppy became a tragic symbol of lost innocence, reminding communities everywhere to stay vigilant when it comes to protecting their children. Leaving that calculated act of cruelty behind, the focus shifts to something entirely different, a case where the suspect couldn't even comprehend the horror he was causing. This is Case 9, Richard Kochkar. Not every tragedy is born from pure malice. Sometimes the human mind snaps, turning an ordinary person into an instrument of absolute chaos. This is the story of a 2-hour descent into madness, ending in a hero's death and a legal verdict that tore a city apart. In early January 2011, a 46-year-old man arrived in Toronto from St. Catharines, Ontario. Estranged from his family, he drifted between temporary shelters, desperately looking for work. Friends who crossed paths with him during this time later testified that he seemed deeply paranoid, troubled, and slipping away from reality. He had a long history of mental health struggles. Back in 2006, he woke his wife past midnight, screaming that he was possessed before turning physically aggressive. But after that episode, he received very little treatment, and his deteriorating condition went largely ignored. On the night of January 11th, he took shelter at a downtown Toronto facility for the homeless. Staff members later recalled how agitated he was, begging them to call the police because he feared he would do something terrible. Yet, as soon as they reached for the phone, he changed his mind and told them to stop. Hours later, just before 5 in the morning, he bolted from the shelter barefoot and jacketless, running straight into the freezing winter night. He wandered through the snowy city streets for a bit, eventually crossing paths with 2 landscapers taking a break at a coffee shop. They had left their pickup truck running, complete with a massive snowplow mounted to the front grille. Without saying a single word, he climbed inside the cab and sped away. The landscapers stepped outside moments later to find their vehicle gone and quickly dialed 911, sparking a chaotic 2-hour rampage. He steered the 5,000-kilogram plow erratically, smashing into parked cars and swerving directly into oncoming traffic, blowing through red lights, and crashing into a luxury car dealership. Witnesses later testified he was screaming incoherently the entire time, screaming about the Taliban, Chinese technology, Russian video games, and wild government conspiracies. One witness recalled hearing him shout that everything was just a Russian video game. He was entirely disconnected from reality. Around 6:30 that morning, a 35-year-old police sergeant spotted the stolen plow and tried to pull it over. The officer was an 11-year veteran of the force, highly respected and recently promoted. Back at home, a loving wife and a young son were waiting for him. Dashcam footage from the cruiser captured the terrifying moments that followed. The plow spun around, heading directly toward the patrol car. The sergeant reversed, trying to back away, but the massive plow kept coming. Then came a critical moment that would define the entire legal battle. The driver slowed the plow down, swinging his door open as if he were about to step out. Thinking the suspect was finally surrendering, the sergeant stepped out of his police vehicle. Instead, the plow suddenly lunged forward. The sergeant fired 3 quick shots at the cab, but they did nothing to stop it. The heavy plow slammed into him, fracturing his skull as he hit the asphalt. The driver didn't slow down. He ran directly over the fallen officer, speeding away and leaving him bleeding out in the cold snow. Paramedics rushed to the scene within minutes, but the trauma was severe. The sergeant was taken to the hospital, where he tragically died. He was the first Toronto officer killed in the line of duty since 1994. The tragic news shook the entire police force and the city. Yet, the rampage went on for another hour. The suspect eventually crashed into a heavy garbage truck, disabling his plow. Heavily armed tactical officers immediately surrounded the vehicle and ordered him out. When he resisted their commands, they tased him 3 times and finally shot him twice to end the threat. Even as paramedics treated his gunshot wounds, his paranoia raged, with him claiming they wanted to poison him and implant microchips. He was taken straight to the hospital under tight police guard. As detectives pieced the night together, they interviewed key witnesses and thoroughly analyzed the dashcam footage. The evidence proved beyond a doubt that he was behind the wheel and had run down the sergeant. There was no questioning the physical act. The real battle would focus entirely on his fractured mental state during those chaotic 2 hours. He faced first-degree murder charges for the officer's death, with the trial kicking off in February 2013, lasting 6 weeks. The defense never denied he was driving the plow, nor did they dispute that his actions took the officer's life. Instead, they argued a severe psychiatric crisis left him completely unable to comprehend what he was doing or realize it was wrong. Essentially, they were pushing for a verdict of not criminally responsible due to mental illness. 3 forensic psychiatrists assessed his state of mind, including one handpicked by the prosecution. Every single one of them concluded he was actively psychotic during the fatal encounter. They testified that his mind had completely fractured from reality, leaving him lost in delusions and hallucinations, entirely unable to grasp what he was doing. Yet they disagreed on his exact diagnosis, debating between an unspecified psychotic disorder and possible schizophrenia. The state agreed that the driver was likely suffering from deep mental instability, but argued that the legal bar for being found not criminally responsible is incredibly high. They pointed out how he slowed the plow as if to turn, then gunned it the moment the officer stepped out, showing deliberate awareness. They demanded a full conviction and a life sentence. The jury went on to deliberate for 3 days. On March 27, 2013, the jurors returned with their decision, finding him not criminally responsible due to a severe mental disorder. This meant they believed his illness completely absolved him of legal guilt. Instead of a prison cell, he would be sent directly to a secure psychiatric facility for long-term treatment. The verdict sparked widespread outrage, especially for the fallen officer's grieving family. Afterward, his widow faced the cameras, sobbing that there was no closure, only a profound sense of injustice. The officer's father delivered a gut-wrenching statement in court, looking directly at the killer and describing the wreckage left in his wake. He shared that a piece of his own soul died when his son was left bleeding in the snow. Even his 4-year-old son was terrified, constantly worrying that the man who destroyed his father would come back for him next. Yet legal experts explain that this special verdict is far from a free pass. Patients are held in a secure psychiatric facility, facing annual review boards to evaluate whether they still pose a threat to public safety. Release only happens once the board is fully convinced that the individual is no longer dangerous. a grueling process that can take decades or even end in lifetime confinement. Initially, he was sent to an Ontario psychiatric hospital. Just 45 days later, the board ordered his continued detention and treatment. Year after year, the board closely monitored his progress. By 2017, 4 years after the trial, they cleared him to live in supervised housing under strict community monitoring. The officer's widow was blindsided and furious when she discovered he was living in an apartment, not a locked hospital ward, pointing out she was never notified, and constantly feared a chance run-in on the streets. Later that year, they even allowed him to travel up to 150 kilometers to visit family. Then, in April 2017, the board handed him an absolute discharge, meaning all supervision and legal conditions were officially wiped away. This decision came after doctors concluded he posed no public threat, largely because he faithfully took his medication and followed treatment. The officer's family was absolutely devastated. To them, the man who stole their loved one's life was walking free just 6 years later. They felt completely betrayed by the justice system, believing the officer's sacrifice had been cheapened. The police force expressed deep disappointment, yet ultimately accepted the court's final process. The tragedy ignited fierce, ongoing debates over how Canada applies its mental illness defense laws. Critics argued the system prioritized the rights of dangerous offenders over grieving victims. Advocates countered that punishing someone for actions taken during a psychotic break solves nothing, and that treatment is the only logical path. Both sides agreed the situation was incredibly tragic, yet they clashed deeply over what justice meant. Today, he lives quietly under strict bans on alcohol, weapons, and any non-prescribed drugs. Violating these terms would trigger an immediate arrest anywhere in the country. The officer is remembered through various memorials, an honor wall, and a police horse named in his memory. Tragically, even that police horse passed away shortly after the dedication, yet his widow and son continue moving forward, carrying the heavy weight of a loss that can never be undone. No matter what verdict was handed down, this case remains one of the most controversial in recent Ontario history. It was a collision of mental illness, public safety, and accountability that left no easy answers. From a tragedy born of a psychological breakdown, the story turns to a mystery that haunted a community for decades and a truth that arrived far too late for real justice. Case 10, Calvin Hoover. Some cold cases linger, not because investigators quit, but because the truth hides in plain sight so long that once discovered, justice has already slipped away. This is the tragic story of a 9-year-old girl who never made it home, a wrongful conviction that destroyed an innocent man's life, and a killer who walked free for 36 years before science finally named him. October 3rd, 1984, started as just another ordinary autumn day in Queensville, a small village north of Toronto. That morning, a 9-year-old girl headed to school as usual, wearing the clothes her mother had picked out and carrying her backpack. Those who knew her called her happy, sensitive, and lively, a 4th grader who loved sports, especially baseball, and brought joy to everyone around her. But that afternoon, her mother and older brother had to travel to a detention center in the city, where her father was held on unrelated charges. Despite the little girl's protests, her mother decided she was too young to go along and left her behind to attend school. The girl rode the school bus home that afternoon, dropping her backpack inside. But when her mother and brother returned shortly after 4 in the afternoon, she had vanished. A clerk at a nearby corner store later confirmed the girl came in alone between 3:30 and 4, bought bubblegum, and left a minute later. She was supposed to meet a friend at a local park, but she never arrived. By early evening, after searching the neighborhood and calling friends with no success, the girl's mother called the police, launching a massive search that immediately mobilized volunteers, officers, and heavy media coverage. Days dragged into weeks, then months. The entire community remained on edge, desperate for answers. Then, on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1984, the girl's body was discovered in a wooded area more than 50 kilometers from her home. She had been stabbed. Evidence recovered at the scene included biological material that would prove crucial decades later, as investigators worked tirelessly to find the killer. In early 1985, Authorities consulted criminal profilers who suggested the suspect was likely a local white male between 19 and 26. Police began interviewing everyone in the community, including immediate neighbors. One of those neighbors was a 25-year-old man living right next door. The girl's mother had once described him to officers as a weird type of guy who played the clarinet, a description that would trigger devastating consequences. Soon, police focused entirely on this neighbor. Investigators interpreted his behavior during their first visit as highly suspicious. He stared straight ahead, showing absolutely no interest in their questions. He skipped her funeral, and when questioned, he made strange comments about innocence and corruption that deeply troubled investigators. In April 1985, police raided his home and arrested him for the girl's murder. His first trial opened in January 1986, with the prosecution relying heavily on forensic evidence, specifically hair and fiber analysis. Experts testified that a hair on the victim's necklace microscopically matched the defendant's, and that hairs from his car were similar to the victim's. The defense countered that this evidence was circumstantial and highly unreliable. Still, the scientific testimony carried massive weight. Even so, the jury acquitted him. The prosecution appealed the acquittal, arguing the trial judge had made critical errors in instructing the jury about reasonable doubt. The appeals court agreed and ordered a new trial, a decision the defense fought all the way to the Supreme Court. But in November 1988, the country's highest court upheld the order for a retrial. The second trial began in June 1992, 7 years after the girl's death. Once again, the prosecution brought out hair comparison evidence alongside jailhouse informants who claimed the defendant had confessed to them in custody, but the defense challenged both the flawed scientific methods and the credibility of these criminal informants. Nevertheless, in July 1992, the jury convicted him of charges related to the child's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. He steadfastly maintained his innocence throughout his entire incarceration. Meanwhile, rapid advances in forensic science were reshaping criminal investigations. By the mid-1990s, sophisticated DNA testing offered possibilities that simply didn't exist in the 1980s. Defense lawyers began pushing for DNA testing on the biological evidence collected from the victim's body back in 1984. After months of legal warfare, DNA testing was finally approved in 1995. The results were stunning. The biological evidence did not match the convicted man. The profile belonged to someone else entirely. In January 1995, the Ontario Court of Appeal overturned his conviction based on this new proof, declaring him innocent. After spending 18 agonizing months in prison for a crime he did not commit, he was freed and later compensated for his wrongful conviction. The first such exoneration in Ontario history. But if he was innocent, who was the killer? The investigation had dragged on for over a decade, and the real killer remained unknown. Police kept working, but with no new leads, the trail went cold again. The families, especially the victim's mother, who once pointed suspicion toward an innocent neighbor, carried the heavy burden of that mistake for years. Then, in October 2020, Toronto police made a shocking announcement. Using advanced genetic genealogy, the very tools that had cracked other cold cases in recent years, they finally identified the person responsible for the 9-year-old's tragic death, a 61-year-old man who had lived in Queensville during the crime. They released his name to the public, Calvin Hoover. He had been a trusted family friend of the victim's household. He had even attended her funeral and helped search for her after she vanished. Detectives had interviewed him during the initial investigation, but he was never taken seriously. He was never considered a suspect, carrying his dark secret all along. But by the time investigators finally identified him, Hoover had already been dead for 5 years. In 2015, he took his own life in Port Hope, Ontario, at the age of 59. He never faced arrest, never stood trial, and never had to face the evidence against him. DNA left on the victim's body back in 1984 was matched to Hoover through genetic genealogy. Detectives even exhumed his remains in June 2020 to definitively confirm the match. The revelation brought deeply mixed emotions. The victim's mother expressed deep gratitude that science finally identified the killer, but also immense frustration that his suicide let him escape real accountability. As for the wrongfully convicted man, now in his 60s, he felt vindicated. though no amount of DNA could ever return his stolen years. Meanwhile, the town of Queensville, which had lived under a cloud of suspicion and fear for so long, finally got answers, even if they arrived far too late. The tragic case sparked intense new debates about wrongful convictions, the flaws of old forensic methods, and how new tech solves cold cases. It also raised painful questions about how the police handled the original case. How did investigators completely overlook Hoover when he was so close to the grieving family? Why did suspicion fall so heavily on an innocent neighbor? What if modern DNA testing had existed back in 1984? Today, the young victim's memory lives on through advocacy for victims' rights and urgent justice system reform. The innocent man who lost years of his life in prison did his best to rebuild. Tragically, he passed away in December 2020, the very year the real killer was finally named. And Calvin Hoover's name remains a dark, sickening footnote. A monster who attended the funeral of the child he murdered, who lived 31 years after his horrific crime without consequence, and ultimately took the truth to his grave. This complex saga spanned 4 decades, 2 trials, and 1 tragic wrongful conviction. Its final breakthrough, solved only by modern genetic science, stands as a triumph of persistence, but also a dark reminder that some answers come far too late to deliver the justice deserved.